policy advisor for the Counterterrorism Project. Tara, thank you so much for joining us. So talk to us about this through, your experience in national security and how critical a role these companies actually play in national security in general.
Sure. Well, I just left the Senate. I was in the room for most of the hearing. I left a little early to get over here. But basically, they have a big role to play, and they've been a little bit resistant towards playing a role. But I think it was clear today as the members on both sides of the aisle were really pressing them on issues not just related to Russian interference in the election, but other countries online operating in problematic fashions, terrorist groups, extremists using their platforms in ways that are violating the terms of service, in ways that are causing national security concerns, and in ways that are threatening to undermine our democracy in terms of our elections. So I think you heard a range of issues of concern. Obviously, the focus has been on Russia, but really the tech companies are starting to come under scrutiny, and that's Twitter, Facebook and Google, not just for ad purchasing problems by, Russians and their inability to track who's making these purchases, but also terrorist groups like ISIS using these platforms and engaging in problematic activities and putting up problematic content as well, all over the globe.
There were a lot of questions and not as many answers. I mean, how satisfied were you with the answers that you heard from these lawyers today?
Sure. I think that, there's been progress made from where we were about a year or so ago, but I think the answers were still somewhat unsatisfactory. I mean, at the end of the day, you're talking about a global platform here, and you're talking about companies that weren't initially set up to deal with these problems. So I think it's becoming clearer and clearer now that there's going to need to be some accountability, whether that comes in the form of legislation, whether that comes in the form of reporting requirements or more transparency. You see, legislation now out of the Senate regarding ads, and I think you're going to potentially see more areas where you're going to see congressional involvement. You also see pressure out of the EU on some of these companies in terms of getting extremist and terrorist content off their platforms, and in terms of monitoring who's buying their buying their ads. In the case of the ad buying, for example, it's likely that campaign laws were being broken, and I think you're going to see legislation, and you are seeing legislation respond to that. I think we have a ways to go. I think it's good that there's an admission. The first, sign of dealing with a problem is admitting there's a problem. So I think you have the admission now that the tech companies are realizing that they're going to need to deal with this. The question becomes sort of how far and how quickly they're going to be able to get a grasp on some of these issues. Again, not just in terms of the election, but many problematic behaviors and activities on their platforms.
How do you suggest these companies handle dealing with this extremist content or ads purchased by foreign actors? I mean, Facebook says it's doubling its security staff, for example. Is this something that you believe these companies can do on their own, or is government intervention necessary here?
Sure. I think there can be a lot more that's done on their own. I mean, if you look at other issue areas where there was pressure on them, they did sort of change and become more aggressive. So child pornography is a good example where they use technology to prevent the upload of problematic child pornographic imagery, which is illegal and also not permitted on their platforms. They can do a similar thing. We've been pushing a counter-extremism project for them to do a similar prevention of upload for the worst terrorist content using the same technology that they use on child pornography. For example, you could build a database and basically prevent certain content from ever being online. In terms of the ad buying, they're really going to need to start. I know a lot of these companies pride themselves on people being anonymous or being able to have anonymity on Twitter, for example. But when you have election campaign laws and you have people purchasing a product, in this case an ad, via your platform, you need to have transparency about who that is. So I think if you don't see them being proactive on some of these issues, they're actually going to probably end up having to face legislation and more regulation on these issues. So it seemed like on the Hill today, the senators were suggesting that they're sort of taking them at their word, but not really trusting that they're going to necessarily go as far as they need to without some sort of legislative solutions on some of these issues.
Your proposal to approach this content the same way they approach child pornography, is that realistic on a scale note? I mean, is the scale of the child pornography problem anything compared to the volume of extremist content that we're talking about here?
Well, actually, on the child pornography side of the equation, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children houses a database of about 30,000 child pornographic images that have been funneled there via law enforcement, tech companies, and whatnot. So those images have prevented the upload of tens of millions of images onto these platforms. A similar approach can be taken, for example, with the worst brutal extremist ISIS content put into a database and have the same technology preventing that from being uploaded. So I think it is a good analogy. It's one that I think is an applicable solution and fix on the counterterrorism front.
Tara, what do you make of the lawmakers bringing up not just Russia, but other foreign actors like China, like Iran, like North Korea?
Well, that's actually a really good question, and that question was brought up by senators during the hearing, where they actually asked the company executives testifying if they could sort of give numbers or had a sense of if other countries were doing this. It seems like they didn't really have a grasp of the data, but it did seem that there was an admission that, yes, countries like Iran, countries like North Korea can all do what Russia was doing. So unless there are mechanisms put in place to prevent this from happening, it's going to be a problem not just in terms of election cycles, but for all sorts of problematic, false, misleading, and potentially damaging national security content on their platforms, whether that's counterintelligence, operations, or whether that's election interference down the line, misinformation campaigns, or terrorist or extremist bomb-making videos, for example. All of this can cause many problems, not just here in the United States, but all around the globe.
All right, Tara Mahler.